My daughter set her stepmother's wedding dress on fire while she was wearing it, and I couldn't be more proud. The call came from hospital security, not the police. Your daughter is in custody here. There's been an incident at a wedding. I was 3 states away on a work site when my phone rang, cement dust still coating my boots. The security guard's voice was carefully neutral, the kind of tone people use when they're not sure if they're talking to a victim or an accomplice. Your ex-wife is in the burn unit. Your daughter used lighter fluid. I dropped my hard hat and started running for my truck before he finished explaining that Mira was being held for attempted murder. My 15-year-old daughter, who cried watching nature documentaries, had apparently doused her stepmother in accelerant and lit a match during the ceremony. The 6-hour drive to Seattle felt like drowning in slow motion. Every call I made went to voicemail. Mira's phone was off. My ex-wife Diane's family blocked my numbers years ago. The hospital wouldn't tell me anything except that a minor was in their psychiatric observation unit and wouldn't be released without a guardian present. I called my sister Vanessa, who lived near the city, and she agreed to meet me there, her voice tight with confusion and worry. She kept asking what happened, and I had no answers. Just this sick certainty that whatever Mira had done, she'd been pushed to it. My daughter didn't have violence in her. She was the kid who caught spiders to release them outside. Hospital security met me at the entrance with 2 uniformed officers. They took my ID and made me empty my pockets into a plastic bin. One officer explained that Mira was being evaluated by a psychiatrist before any charges were filed. He asked if I knew she had violent tendencies, and I told him he was insane, that something was wrong, that my daughter wouldn't hurt anyone without a reason. The officer exchanged a look with his partner that made my blood pressure spike. He said witnesses described Mira walking up to the bride during the vows, pulling out a bottle of lighter fluid, and methodically soaking the dress before anyone could react. Then she lit the match while making direct eye contact with Diane. They led me through a maze of corridors to a locked psychiatric ward. Through a window and a heavy door, I could see Mira sitting on a bed in a paper gown, her hands bandaged. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her face was blank, staring at nothing. A nurse buzzed me in, and I went to her immediately, kneeling in front of where she sat. She didn't look at me at first, just kept staring past my shoulder. I asked if she was hurt, and she held up her bandaged hands. "Second-degree burns from not letting go of the lighter fast enough," she said flatly. "Worth it, though." Her voice had this hollow quality I'd never heard before, like something inside her had broken and she'd stopped caring about putting the pieces back together. Why? Psychiatrist arrived 20 minutes later, a woman named Dr. Keiko Yamada, who asked to speak with me privately first. We sat in a small office while she reviewed notes on her tablet. She told me Mira had been completely cooperative during the evaluation, answering every question with a disturbing calm. Dr. Yamada said Mira showed no signs of psychosis or dissociation, that she understood exactly what she'd done and claimed she'd do it again, given the chance. The doctor's expression was troubled as she explained that Mira kept repeating that someone had to stop Diane before the wedding was finalized. When asked to elaborate, Mira had requested a lawyer and refused to say anything else. Dr. Yamada wanted to know if there was any history of abuse or trauma I was aware of. I told her about the divorce 3 years ago, how Diane had gotten primary custody despite my fighting for 50-50. The judge had been sympathetic to Diane's argument that Mira needed stability, and I traveled for work too much. Visitation every other weekend and alternating holidays. Standard stuff that ripped my heart out but seemed normal enough. Diane had remarried last year to some guy named Trevor who worked in tech, and Mira had seemed okay with it during our video calls. She never complained, never said anything was wrong. Dr. Yamada asked if I'd noticed any changes in Mira's behavior recently, and I realized with sick guilt that I hadn't been paying attention. The last 2 months I'd been on a major project in Montana with spotty cell service. Our calls had been brief, and I'd been too tired to notice if something was off. Detective Ruth Strand showed up an hour later with a folder thick with witness statements. She sat across from me in that same small office and laid out photos of the crime scene. The wedding had been at some upscale venue on the waterfront, white chairs and flowers everywhere. The photos showed scorch marks on the ground, Diane's melted veil, and dark stains that must have been blood or accelerant. Detective Strand asked what I knew about Mira's relationship with her stepmother, and I said it seemed fine as far as I knew. The detective's expression suggested she didn't believe me. She asked if Mira had ever threatened violence, and I said absolutely not, that this made no sense. Strand pulled out her phone and showed me a text message screenshot. It was from Mira's number to a friend, sent 2 weeks ago. "If she marries him, I'll burn her alive." I stared at those words and couldn't connect them to my daughter. They let me see Mira again after the detective finished her questions. My sister Vanessa had arrived by then and sat with me outside the observation room. She'd brought Mira's favorite snacks and a change of clothes, always practical even in a crisis. We waited for the nurse to unlock the door and then went in together. Mira looked up when we entered, and her face crumpled when she saw Vanessa. She started crying for the first time since I'd arrived, these huge gulping sobs that shook her whole body. Vanessa sat next to her on the bed and pulled her close while Mira kept saying she was sorry. She was so sorry, but she couldn't let it happen. Couldn't let what happen? Vanessa asked gently, and Mira just cried harder. The nurse came in to check Mira's bandages and give her something for anxiety. She swallowed the pill without argument, and gradually the crying slowed to hiccups. I asked her directly what had happened, why she'd done this, and she looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Dad, Diane isn't marrying Trevor. She's already married to him. This was a fake ceremony for his family." Mira's voice was steadier now, more focused. She said the whole thing was a scam, and Trevor's real wife was at the wedding pretending to be Diane's sister. I asked what she meant by scam, and Mira explained that Trevor was committing immigration fraud and insurance fraud at minimum, probably more she hadn't figured out yet. Diane was helping him, and they'd been using Mira to make it all look legitimate. My brain couldn't process what she was saying. I asked why she hadn't just told someone, called the police, reported it through proper channels instead of setting someone on fire. Mira's laugh was bitter and wrong coming from a 15-year-old. I did tell someone, Dad. I told you, 3 months ago when you called from Montana. I told you Diane was doing something illegal with Trevor and his documents. You said you'd look into it, and then never brought it up again. I felt ice spread through my chest, because I had a vague memory of that conversation, of being exhausted after a 16-hour shift, and Mira saying something about Trevor and papers. I told her I'd check it out and then completely forgotten because I'd been too focused on work deadlines. Vanessa asked what kind of fraud Mira was talking about, and Mira laid it out with frightening clarity. Trevor had entered the country on a student visa that expired 2 years ago. He married someone named Priya for a green card, but needed to stay married for at least 2 years to avoid suspicion. Meanwhile, he'd started a relationship with Diane and wanted to marry her for real. So they came up with a plan where Trevor stayed legally married to Priya while doing a fake ceremony with Diane. Priya got paid to keep quiet and pretend to be family at events. They'd filed joint tax returns under Trevor and Diane's names even though he was legally married to someone else. They'd collect insurance benefits fraudulently. And Mira was being used as proof that Trevor was a good family man who'd taken on a stepchild. I asked how she knew all this, and Mira said she'd found documents in Trevor's home office. Marriage certificates, tax forms, emails between Diane and Trevor planning the whole thing. She'd taken photos of everything and tried to show me, but I hadn't taken her seriously. She tried calling CPS, but they said it wasn't their jurisdiction. She tried an anonymous tip to immigration, but never heard back. She'd been documenting everything for months, watching Diane and Trevor act out this elaborate lie while using her as a prop. The fake wedding was supposed to be the final piece, making it look legitimate to Trevor's family, who didn't know about Priya. Mira had decided if no one would stop them legally, she'd stop them herself. Detective Strand came back with more questions, this time asking about the documents Mira mentioned. Mira gave her the password to her cloud storage, where she'd uploaded everything. Strand stepped out to verify the information and came back 20 minutes later with a completely different expression on her face. She asked Mira to walk her through the timeline of when she'd discovered each piece of evidence and reported it. Mira recited dates and times with perfect recall, naming every adult she'd tried to tell. She'd gone to her school counselor who'd said it was a family matter. She'd called a legal aid hotline who'd told her minors couldn't file fraud complaints. She'd emailed the IRS anonymous tip line and gotten an automated response. She'd tried everyone she could think of and been dismissed or ignored every single time. Strand told me she needed to make some calls and left the room. Vanessa was staring at Mira like seeing her for the first time. This 15-year-old who'd been running her own investigation while the adults in her life failed her. I asked Mira why she hadn't pushed harder with me, and she said she did push, Dad. Every phone call, every video chat, every visit. I tried to tell you something was wrong. You kept saying you trusted Diane to take care of me and that I should focus on school. Her words hit like physical blows because she was right. I've been so focused on not being a difficult co-parent, on not making waves with Diane, that I'd ignored my daughter's increasingly desperate attempts to get my attention. Hospital security brought dinner on plastic trays, but none of us ate. Mira was exhausted from the medication and emotional crash, curling up on the bed with her head on Vanessa's lap. My sister stroked her hair and asked quiet questions about what life had been like at Diane's house. Mira described a perfect surface with rot underneath. Diane and Trevor acting like the ideal blended family in public while having vicious arguments behind closed doors. Finding Priya crying in the bathroom during a family barbecue while Diane smiled outside. Watching Trevor coach Diane on how to lie to immigration officers. Being told to call Trevor Dad in front of certain people, but not others. Living in a house where truth was negotiable, and Mira's attempts to expose it were treated as teenage drama. A nurse came in around 8 to say visiting hours were ending soon. Strand had called to say she'd be back in the morning with someone from immigration enforcement and possibly the FBI. Mira would be held overnight for observation, but no charges were being filed, yet pending. Investigation of her claims. The hospital was treating this as a psychiatric hold rather than criminal custody, which meant she'd be in this locked ward instead of juvenile detention. I asked if I could stay, and they said no. Family could return at 9 the next morning. Mira grabbed my hand when I started to leave, her bandaged fingers gripping tight. Dad, check on Priya, please. She's at Trevor's apartment. The address is in my phone notes. Someone needs to help her before Trevor figures out what I did. Vanessa and I drove to the address Mira had given us, a high-rise downtown. The doorman refused to let us up without permission, but Vanessa used her lawyer voice and mentioned immigration fraud until he got nervous enough to call the apartment. A woman's voice came through the intercom asking who we were. I explained we were Mira's family and needed to talk about Trevor. Long pause, then the door buzzed open. We took the elevator to the 12th floor and found apartment 1207 with the door already cracked open. The woman waiting inside was small and terrified, her eyes red from crying. She asked if Mira was okay and if the police were coming. Priya invited us in, and the apartment was strange, looking lived in but impersonal. She explained Trevor maintained this place for appearances, staying there when he needed to be legally separated from Diane. Priya had been living there for 2 years, essentially trapped because Trevor controlled her immigration status. She showed us her marriage certificate, her green card application still pending, and emails from Trevor threatening to report her for fraud if she didn't cooperate with his plan. He'd promised the arrangement would end after 2 years when his permanent residency came through. But then he'd met Diane and decided he wanted both women in his life for different purposes. Priya for legal status, Diane for actual partnership. Priya said Mira had found her one day when Trevor sent the girl to drop off documents. Mira had realized something was wrong when she saw Priya's belongings mixed with Trevor's, with wedding photos on the shelf. The two of them had started meeting secretly, with Mira helping Priya document everything. Priya wanted out, but was terrified of deportation. Mira had promised to find a way to help that wouldn't get Priya sent back to India. The plan had been to gather enough evidence that immigration would investigate Trevor instead of Priya, proving she was a victim of fraud rather than a willing participant. But the fake wedding had accelerated the timeline, and Mira had panicked, doing something desperate to stop the ceremony before it added another layer of legal complexity. Vanessa asked why Priya hadn't gone to authorities herself, and Priya pulled up her sleeve to show bruises on her arm. Trevor wasn't just controlling her through immigration status. He'd made it clear what would happen if she caused problems. She'd tried calling a domestic violence hotline once, and Trevor had found out, smashing her phone and threatening worse. She was isolated with no family in the country and limited English, exactly the kind of victim trafficker's target. Mira had been her only advocate, a 15-year-old who'd seen through the perfect family facade and decided to do something about it. Priya started crying again, saying Mira had saved her life by stopping that wedding, even if the method was extreme. My phone rang with a call from Detective Strand. She asked if I was with Priya and seemed unsurprised when I said yes. She told me to stay there, that she was sending officers to secure the location and take Priya's statement. Immigration enforcement was getting involved along with the fraud division. They'd pulled Trevor's records and found multiple red flags that had been overlooked or buried. Diane's financial records showed unexplained deposits matching the timeline of when Trevor would have been paying Priya. The documents Mira had collected were enough to open a full investigation. Strand said Mira had done in 6 months what should have taken law enforcement weeks to uncover, all while being dismissed by every adult she'd asked for help. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes to stay with Priya until investigators could do a full interview. Vanessa and I left her phone number and headed back to Vanessa's apartment. Neither of us could sleep, sitting in her living room drinking coffee and trying to process everything. My sister finally asked what I was going to do about custody, and I said whatever it took to get Mira out of Diane's house permanently. Vanessa offered to handle the legal work, her expression grim. She said the fact that Diane had been using a minor in a fraud scheme was grounds for emergency custody modification at minimum. The fact that I'd been kept in the dark about Mira's living situation could work in my favor, but we'd need to move fast before Diane's lawyers got involved. The hospital called at 6 in the morning to say Mira had asked for me. Vanessa and I grabbed breakfast sandwiches and coffee before heading over. Mira looked better, less hollow, though her hands were still bandaged. Dr. Yamada was there doing another evaluation. She asked Mira to explain her mental state when she'd lit the fire, and Mira described a moment of perfect clarity. She'd watched Diane put on that dress, knowing it represented another layer of lies. She'd thought about Priya trapped in that apartment. She'd remembered every adult who'd dismissed her concerns. And she'd decided that sometimes the only way to make people pay attention was to do something impossible to ignore. The dress had been symbolic, Mira said, burning away the beautiful surface to expose what was underneath. Dr. Yamada made notes and asked if Mira understood the potential consequences of her actions. Mira nodded and said she'd researched the laws, knew she could be tried as an adult for attempted murder or aggravated assault. She'd accepted that risk when she bought the lighter fluid. The doctor asked if Mira felt remorse, and she thought carefully before answering. She said she regretted hurting Diane physically, that she'd aimed for the dress rather than Diane herself, but hadn't accounted for how fast the fire would spread. She'd caused second-degree burns on Diane's arms and legs when she'd tried to put out the flames. Mira said if she could go back, she'd find a different way. But given the same circumstances where no one would listen, she wasn't sure what that different way would have been. Detective Strand arrived with a woman from the FBI named Special Agent Nora Quinlan. They asked to interview Mira with me present and a child advocate the hospital had assigned. Agent Quinlan explained they were investigating Trevor for immigration fraud, identity fraud, tax fraud, and potential human trafficking given Priya's circumstances. Diane was being looked at as an accomplice. They needed Mira to walk them through everything she'd discovered and documented. Mira spent 3 hours going through her evidence, explaining how she'd found each document and what it proved. Her organizational skills were impressive. Every file labeled and time-stamped, with notes about where she'd found it and why it mattered. Agent Quinlan asked why Mira hadn't trusted the authorities to handle this, and Mira's laugh was sharp. I reported this to 5 different agencies and got blown off every time. You want to know why I took matters into my own hands? Because the system is designed to ignore kids. No one takes a teenager seriously when they report something, especially if they're reporting their own parent. I had evidence, I had documentation, I had witnesses, and every single adult told me I was exaggerating or misunderstanding. Her voice rose with frustration. So yeah, I set a dress on fire. And you know what? That finally got you people to look at the evidence I've been waving in front of your faces for months. Strand and Quinlan exchanged glances, and Strand asked if Mira had considered that setting the fire might have destroyed evidence. Mira pulled up her phone and showed them cloud backups, physical copies in a safe deposit box she'd set up with Vanessa's help, and encrypted files stored multiple places. She'd prepared for every contingency, including the possibility that Diane would retaliate by destroying documents. The level of planning was sobering, coming from someone who still had braces on her teeth. Agent Quinlan said off the record that Mira had conducted a better investigation than some trained agents she'd worked with. On the record, she had to remind Mira that vigilante justice was still illegal no matter how thorough the research behind it. The prosecutor's office called that afternoon requesting a meeting. Vanessa came as Mira's attorney, even though she usually handled corporate law, not criminal defense. The The prosecutor was a stern woman named Diana Wolfe, who laid out the situation bluntly. Mira had committed a serious crime with multiple witnesses and physical evidence. The optics were terrible. A teenage girl attacking someone at their wedding. Public sympathy would be with the victim, regardless of context. However, the evidence Mira had provided was leading to arrests in a significant fraud ring. Trevor had been using the same scheme with multiple women, not just Priya. They'd found 3 other victims who'd been trafficked under similar circumstances. Diane had been involved with all of it, helping forge documents and providing cover. Wolfe said the office was prepared to offer a deal. Mira would plead to misdemeanor assault with probation and mandatory therapy. No jail time given her age and circumstances. In exchange, she'd testify against Trevor and Diane if the cases went to trial. Vanessa asked about sealing Mira's record, and Wolfe said that was possible after successful completion of probation. I asked what would happen if we rejected the deal, and Wolfe's expression hardened. She'd prosecute fully, pushing for adult charges given the premeditation and severity. She understood Mira had reasons, but the law didn't allow for burning people alive no matter the justification. We had 24 hours to decide. Mira wanted to reject the deal, arguing she shouldn't have to plead guilty when she'd been trying to stop crimes no one else would address. Vanessa explained legal reality versus moral correctness and how courts didn't always align. She said taking the deal meant Mira would avoid years of legal battles and potential prison time. She could move forward with her life instead of being stuck in the system. I asked what Mira really wanted, and she said she wanted Diane and Trevor in prison where they couldn't hurt anyone else. Vanessa promised that would happen regardless of whether Mira took the deal. The fraud evidence was solid and had nothing to do with how it was obtained. Mira's testimony would strengthen the case, but wasn't essential. We spent that night at Vanessa's apartment, Mira sleeping in the guest room while my sister and I stayed up making plans. I'd already contacted my boss about family leave and started the process for emergency custody modification. Vanessa had drafted the initial paperwork and found a family court judge willing to hear the case expedited given the circumstances. She'd also been contacted by 3 different news outlets wanting to interview Mira about the wedding incident. Vanessa had shut them all down, but warned me the story was spreading on social media. Videos from the wedding had been posted by guests, showing Mira calmly walking up the aisle with a bottle in her hand. The footage cut off before the fire started, but the implication was clear. The next morning, we accepted the plea deal. Mira signed paperwork in the prosecutor's office with Vanessa guiding her through each section. Wolfe seemed relieved, probably because prosecuting a teenage girl for assault would have been a PR nightmare, even if legally justified. She explained Mira would have a probation officer, mandatory therapy appointments, and community service requirements. The terms included staying away from Diane and Trevor, which Mira said would be easy since she never wanted to see either of them again. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week. Wolfe said they'd aim for minimal publicity but couldn't control what media chose to cover. Diane's mother called me that evening, screaming about how I'd raised a monster and destroyed her daughter's life. I let her rant for 3 minutes before asking if she knew about Trevor's immigration fraud. Silence on the other end of the line. I asked if she knew Trevor was legally married to someone else. More silence. I told her the FBI was investigating and she might want to consult a lawyer about what she knew and when. She hung up without another word. Diane's whole family had been at that wedding, watching what they thought was a beautiful ceremony. They'd probably seen Mira as a disturbed child acting out. Now they'd have to reckon with the possibility she'd been the only honest person in the room. The arraignment was quick, just Mira standing before a judge and entering her guilty plea. The judge asked if she understood the charges and consequences. Mira said yes, clearly. The judge asked if anyone had coerced her into this plea and she said no. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks out to allow time for a present-tensing investigation. We walked out of the courthouse to find protesters on both sides. One group held signs calling Mira a hero for exposing fraud and trafficking. The other group called her a dangerous criminal who belonged in prison. News cameras caught everything as Vanessa rushed us to her car. Mira kept her head down, but I saw her glance at the hero signs with something like pride. The custody hearing happened 2 days later in family court. Diane appeared via video link from her lawyer's office, her arms in bandages. She argued I was trying to exploit the situation to take Mira away, that she'd been a good mother, and Mira's actions proved the girl needed help Diane could provide. Her lawyer emphasized stability and consistency, suggesting Mira needed to stay in her current school and community. My lawyer, working with Vanessa, presented evidence of the fraud scheme and Diane's use of Mira in illegal activities. She showed the judge Mira's attempts to report the situation and how Diane had shut them down. She argued that Diane had prioritized her relationship with Trevor over Mira's safety and well-being. Judge Roger Kaplan reviewed everything methodically. He asked Mira where she wanted to live, and she said with me that she'd never felt safe at Diane's house. The judge asked why she hadn't said anything during previous custody reviews, and Mira explained she'd tried, but adults always took Diane's side. She'd learned early that complaining made things worse, that she had to handle problems herself, because no one would believe a kid over a competent-seeming adult. Judge Kaplan's expression suggested he'd heard similar stories too many times. He asked Diane directly if she'd been aware of Trevor's immigration status and fraud activities. Diane claimed ignorance, but her lawyer's body language suggested otherwise. The judge said he'd rule within 48 hours. We got the decision via email the next morning. Judge Kaplan had granted me emergency temporary custody, citing Diane's involvement in criminal activities and her failure to protect Mira from an unstable situation. Custody would be reassessed after criminal proceedings concluded. But meanwhile, Mira would live with me. I could relocate her to where I was based currently, which meant enrolling her in new schools and disrupting her life, but getting her away from Seattle. Diane was granted supervised visitation pending resolution of her criminal charges. Vanessa said this was the best outcome we could have hoped for, given the circumstances. Mira cried when I told her, but this time from relief rather than fear. Packing up Mira's things from Diane's house was surreal. Diane's lawyer was there to supervise, making sure we only took Mira's belongings. The house still smelled like the expensive candles Diane loved, everything decorated in shades of white and gray. Mira's room was in the basement, painted purple at her request but otherwise sparse. She packed clothes and books, while I boxed up photos and personal items. I found a journal hidden under her mattress, pages filled with dates and observations about Trevor and Diane's activities. Mira had been documenting everything in writing, too, insurance against digital evidence being destroyed. The last entry was from the morning of the wedding. If no one will stop them, I will. Sometimes good people have to do bad things. Trevor was arrested 3 days later as he tried to board a flight to Vancouver. Immigration enforcement had flagged his passport and detained him at the airport. Agent Quinlan called to tell me they'd found evidence of 5 different women he'd married for immigration purposes over the past 10 years. He'd run the same scheme repeatedly, finding vulnerable women who needed green cards and exploiting their desperation. Diane had been involved with the most recent iterations, helping him maintain the appearance of legitimacy. They'd made substantial money selling green card marriages, charging women desperate to stay in the country. Priya had been one of the few who hadn't paid, instead being controlled through threats and violence. Diane was arrested the same day at the hospital where she was being treated for her burns. The charges included immigration fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The prosecutor added child endangerment for involving Mira in the scheme. Her bail was set at $500,000, which her family couldn't raise. She'd be held at the county jail until trial. I felt no sympathy watching her. Mugshot appear on news sites. This was the woman I'd married, who I'd trusted with our daughter, and she'd spent years running criminal operations while playing the perfect suburban mom. The betrayal cut deep, but the vindication cut deeper. Mira had been right about everything. The presentencing investigation included interviews with Mira's teachers, therapists, and family members. The investigator, a woman named Lydia Cross, spoke with me for 2 hours about Mira's home life and development. I told her everything I knew, including my own failures to listen when Mira had tried to tell me something was wrong. Lydia asked about Mira's mental health, and I explained she'd been seeing a trauma therapist since the incident. The therapist had diagnosed PTSD from living in the unstable environment at Diane's house, where truth was relative and Mira had been forced to participate in lies. The report would influence the judge's sentencing decision. Priya testified before a grand jury about Trevor's fraud ring. Agent Quinlan said her testimony was compelling and detailed, providing evidence for charges against 6 other people involved in the operation. Priya had been granted a special visa for crime victims and was working with an immigration attorney to secure permanent status independent of Trevor. She'd sent a letter from Mira thanking her for having the courage to act when no one else would. Priya wrote that she understood why Mira had done something extreme, that sometimes the system fails so completely that people are forced into impossible choices. She hoped Mira wouldn't be punished too harshly for trying to help when every official channel had shut her down. Mira started therapy 3 times a week, working with a specialist in moral injury and complex trauma. The therapist explained that Mira was dealing with the aftermath of having to take violent action to protect someone when adults failed to intervene. She'd crossed a moral line that couldn't be uncrossed, even if her reasons were understandable. The therapy focused on processing the trauma of living in Diane's house and developing healthier coping mechanisms than setting people on fire. Mira was resistant at first, arguing she'd done the right thing in a bad situation. The therapist didn't disagree, but emphasized that right and legal weren't always the same thing, and Mira needed to find ways to advocate for justice that wouldn't land her in prison. Social media had turned Mira into a controversial figure. Some people called her a hero who'd exposed human trafficking and fraud. Others called her a violent criminal who deserved prison regardless of her motives. True crime bloggers dissected every detail of the case, debating whether her actions were justified. Someone started a legal defense fund that raised $20,000 before Vanessa shut it down, explaining we weren't soliciting donations. Another group started a counter-petition, demanding Mira be tried as an adult for attempted murder. The attention was overwhelming and invasive, with reporters trying to contact Mira's friends and teachers for quotes. I had to change our phone numbers twice to stop the harassment. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for early October, 6 weeks after the plea. Vanessa prepared Mira to speak, helping her write a statement that expressed understanding of the severity of her actions while explaining the impossible situation she'd been in. The therapist worked with her on managing anxiety during public speaking. I watched my daughter practice in Vanessa's living room, this kid who'd uncovered a criminal enterprise and tried to stop it the only way she'd known how. She looked tiny, standing there in dress clothes Vanessa had bought for court appearances. Her hands were healed from the burns, but she still picked at the scars when she was nervous. The courtroom was packed with media and observers when we arrived. Diana Wolf was there representing the prosecution, along with Agent Quinlan, who'd requested permission to attend. Diane's family filled 2 rows on the right side, glaring at us. Priya sat in the back wearing sunglasses and a scarf, trying to remain invisible. The judge was the same Roger Kaplan who'd handled the custody hearing, which Vanessa said was fortunate since he already understood the context. Kaplan called the court to order and asked Mira to approach the bench. She walked up with Vanessa beside her, standing straight despite her hands shaking. Wolf presented the prosecution's position first. She acknowledged the mitigating circumstances and Mira's cooperation with ongoing investigations. She noted that Mira's evidence had led to multiple arrests and the rescue of trafficking victims. However, she emphasized that Mira had planned and executed an attack that caused serious bodily harm. She'd bought lighter fluid with intent to commit violence. She'd acted with premeditation rather than in the heat of passion. Wolf recommended the court impose the maximum allowable probation terms and substantial community service to drive home the seriousness of taking justice into her own hands. The law existed for a reason, and vigilante actions couldn't be normalized no matter how pure the motivation. Vanessa presented the defense position, arguing that Mira had exhausted every legal avenue before taking drastic action. She presented documentation of Mira's attempts to report the fraud to multiple agencies, all of which had dismissed her or claimed they couldn't help. She showed evidence of Diane using Mira in fraudulent schemes, putting her in situations where she was complicit in crimes. Vanessa argued that Mira had been protecting both herself and trafficking victims from ongoing harm when systems designed to help them had failed completely. She requested minimal sentencing given Mira's age, her cooperation, and the extraordinary circumstances. She argued that Mira needed trauma treatment, not punishment, and that probation could be structured to provide intensive therapy rather than punitive measures. Judge Kaplan asked Mira if she wanted to make a statement. She stepped up to the microphone and pulled out her written speech, but then set it aside. She spoke without notes, her voice clear and steady. She said she knew what she'd done was illegal and dangerous. She understood she could have killed Diane even though that wasn't her intent. She explained she'd spent months trying to do things the right way, following rules and reporting to authorities, and every single adult had failed to act. She'd watched Priya suffer, watched Diane and Trevor exploit desperate women, and known that if she didn't do something, the fake wedding would add another layer of legal protection to their crimes. She'd made a choice to prioritize stopping active harm over following rules that clearly weren't working. Mira said she wasn't asking for sympathy or to be excused. She was asking the court to consider why a 15-year-old had felt compelled to take violent action when every system designed to protect people had failed. She asked them to think about what message it sent to kids who tried to report abuse and fraud and trafficking, only to be dismissed as dramatic or confused. She said she'd accept whatever punishment the court imposed, but she hoped something would change so the next kid in her situation wouldn't have to choose between staying silent and committing a crime to be heard. When she finished, the courtroom was completely silent. Even Diane's family looked uncomfortable. Judge Kaplan took a 10-minute recess to review the materials. When he returned, he spent 15 minutes delivering his ruling. He said this was one of the most difficult cases he'd encountered because both sides had valid points. Mira had committed a serious crime that couldn't be excused. However, she'd done so after attempting to work within a system that had categorically failed her. He noted that 5 agencies had been presented with evidence of criminal activity and declined to investigate. He said the court couldn't encourage vigilante justice, but neither could it ignore the reality that Mira had saved multiple women from ongoing exploitation because official channels wouldn't act. Judge Kaplan sentenced Mira to 3 years of probation with intensive supervision. She'd have weekly check-ins with a probation officer and therapy 3 times a week. She'd complete 500 hours of community service, specifically with organizations that helped trafficking victims. She'd write a formal apology to Diane acknowledging the physical harm caused, though she wouldn't be required to apologize for exposing the crimes. The conviction would remain on her record, but could be sealed after successful completion of probation. He warned Mira that any violation would result in immediate custody and potential adult prosecution. He also noted that the court was recommending systemic review of how agencies handle reports from minors, using her case as an example of failure at multiple levels. We left the courthouse surrounded by cameras and shouted questions. Vanessa shielded Mira while I navigated us to the car. Protesters on both sides were louder now, some cheering the sentence and others calling it too lenient. I saw Priya in the crowd, catching my eye and mouthing thank you before disappearing into the mass of people. Agent Quinlan found us in the parking garage and told Vanessa the FBI would be submitting formal commendations for Mira's investigative work, even though they couldn't officially endorse her methods. She said Mira had a future in law enforcement if she wanted it, though she'd need to channel that determination into legal approaches. The drive back to Vanessa's apartment was quiet. Mira stared out the window, processing everything. I asked how she felt, and she said empty, like she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. She asked if I was disappointed in her, and I told her honestly that I was disappointed in myself for not listening sooner. I was proud of her for trying to protect someone when adults wouldn't. I was grateful she'd survived Diane's house and the legal system. But I also needed her to understand that what she'd done was dangerous and could have ended much worse. She nodded and said she knew, that she'd been lucky the fire hadn't spread faster, or Diane hadn't been hurt worse. She didn't think she could have lived with herself if Diane had died. Trevor's trial started 3 months later, and I took time off work to attend with Mira. She'd been subpoenaed as a witness and spent hours being prepped by prosecutors. The trial lasted 2 weeks with testimony from Priya and 3 other women Trevor had exploited. Mira's evidence was presented through forensic accountants and immigration specialists who'd analyzed the documents she'd collected. The defense tried to argue Trevor had been naive rather than malicious, but the pattern was too clear. He'd run the same scam for a decade, profiting off vulnerable women while maintaining a legitimate appearance. The jury convicted him on 16 counts of fraud, immigration violations, and conspiracy. His sentencing wouldn't happen for months, but he was looking at 20 years minimum. Diane's trial was separate and happened 4 months after Trevor's. Her defense was that she'd been manipulated by Trevor, that she hadn't understood the full scope of his activities. The prosecution presented emails showing Diane had been an active participant, recruiting women and managing logistics. They showed financial records of her receiving payment for her role. They called Mira as a witness, and she testified about living in a house where she'd been coached to lie to cover up crimes. Diane's lawyer tried to paint Mira as a troubled teen seeking attention, but the mountain of documentary evidence contradicted that narrative. The jury convicted Diane on 12 counts. Her sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 months out. Mira finished her first semester of homeschooling while working through probation requirements. She'd been doing her community service at an organization that helped trafficking victims find resources and legal assistance. The coordinator told me Mira had an instinct for connecting with survivors, that she understood the frustration of not being believed and the desperation of trying to escape a bad situation. Mira had been helping women navigate immigration paperwork and document abuse for restraining orders. She'd found purpose in the work that seemed to be helping her heal from her own trauma. Her therapist said Mira was making progress processing the moral injury of having to use violence to protect someone. I transferred to a permanent position near Vanessa City so Mira could have stability. We found an apartment with 2 bedrooms and slowly built a normal life. Mira was still adjusting to being able to trust that adults would listen to her, testing boundaries and waiting for me to dismiss her concerns. We went to family therapy once a week, working on rebuilding our relationship after years of distance. I had to prove consistently that I was present and paying attention now. It was slow work, but we were making progress. She'd started opening up about what life at Diane's had been like, the constant lying and fear of triggering Diane's temper, the way Trevor had looked at her sometimes that made her skin crawl. Social media moved on to other controversies, but Mira's case had left an impact. Several organizations focused on believing children and improving reporting systems cited her situation as an example of systemic failure. Some states introduced legislation requiring agencies to investigate reports from minors more thoroughly. The FBI updated training protocols for agents handling tips about fraud and trafficking. These were small changes in a massive system, but they represented acknowledgement that Mira's experience wasn't isolated. Other kids had been ignored and dismissed when trying to report serious crimes. The attention her case received had forced institutions to examine how they handled youth reports. Diane was sentenced to 15 years for her role in Trevor's fraud ring. The judge noted she'd had more agency than she claimed and had actively participated in exploiting vulnerable women. She'd shown no remorse during trial, instead continuing to portray herself as a victim of circumstances. The judge said her willingness to use her own daughter in criminal schemes demonstrated a fundamental lack of parental responsibility. Diane would be eligible for parole after 10 years. Her family stopped reaching out to me after the sentencing, probably finally accepting that their daughter had been running criminal operations while they'd thought she was just a divorced mom trying to move on. Mira and I visited Priya regularly. She'd gotten her green card through the special visa program and was working as a translator for refugee services. She'd started dating someone she met through a support group and was building a life free from Trevor's control. She told Mira repeatedly that she'd saved her life, that she'd been weeks from suicide when Mira had stopped that wedding. Priya said she'd been too scared and broken to save herself, and having a teenager believe her and fight for her had given her hope that escape was possible. She'd been able to testify against Trevor because Mira had documented everything so thoroughly, providing evidence that backed up her story. 2 years after the sentencing, Mira's probation officer recommended early termination, given her perfect compliance and exceptional community service work. Judge Kaplan approved the request, noting that Mira had turned a traumatic experience into advocacy that was helping others. The conviction would be sealed as promised, though Mira would always carry the knowledge of what she'd done. Her therapist said Mira had processed the moral injury as much as possible, accepting that she'd crossed lines while understanding why she'd felt compelled to do so. Mira had learned to channel her fierce protective instincts into legal advocacy rather than violence. She was planning to study criminal justice in college with the goal of becoming a prosecutor who actually listened to victim reports. The organization where Mira did community service offered her a paid position as a youth advocate. She'd be working with teenage trafficking victims, helping them navigate the legal system and connecting them with resources. Her supervisor said Mira had a gift for meeting survivors where they were and believing them when they reported abuse. She understood from experience how isolating it was to tell the truth and be dismissed. Mira accepted the job with the condition she could continue it part-time through college. She'd found her purpose in making sure other kids didn't face the same impossible choices she'd faced. On the 3rd anniversary of the wedding fire, Mira and I visited the cemetery where my father was buried. We'd started a tradition of going there when we needed perspective on difficult situations. Mira sat on the grass near his headstone and talked about everything that had happened and where she was now. She said she still had nightmares about the fire sometimes, still saw Diane's dress going up in flames. She still questioned whether there had been another way, a path she'd missed that would have stopped Trevor without violence. But she also knew she'd saved Priya and 4 other women from ongoing exploitation. She'd exposed crimes that would have continued. She'd proven that kids could be credible witnesses and investigators if adults would just listen. We drove home as the sun set, Mira quiet but peaceful in the passenger seat. She'd grown 3 inches and filled out, no longer looking like the terrified 15-year-old who'd been held in a psychiatric ward. She carried scars, both physical and emotional, but she'd survived systems that should have protected her and hadn't. She'd made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences. And somehow, she'd found a way to transform that trauma into purpose, helping others navigate the same broken systems she'd faced. I was proud of her resilience, her integrity, her refusal to give up on doing what was right, even when it cost her everything. She'd set a dress on fire to expose rot underneath beauty, and the world had finally paid attention. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.